Hello? Shall I? Oh, that sounds quite throaty, doesn't it? Quite like that. Listen, thanks for coming. I think we'll make a start.
Is it better to be without the mic? Yeah. So the purpose of this lunchtime session is just to bring to give a brief overview of the WSIS plus 10 process. We're going to explain what that is, why it's important to civil society groups, and if you're interested in being involved, how you can do so, because a number of civil society organisations have started to prepare for discussions coming up at the UN General Assembly in November and December this year, which potentially could have a very big impact on the way the internet's governed, and therefore on the human rights and democratic potential for the internet to develop in the future. So it's potentially a very momentous discussion, and it's happening in one of the most kind of politicized and antagonistic environments in which it could happen, the UN General Assembly, where there's probably a very low level of knowledge about internet issues and internet policy, but a very high degree of political competition and political awareness. So from the internet's point of view, it's not a great place for the discussion to be taking place, but it's happening. And I think it's useful for us to understand where it came from. And essentially, 10, 12 years ago, the UN decided it wanted to look at the Information Society and Information Technology for Development, and established a process called the World Summit on the Information Society. And my colleague Leah, my colleague Anya, will just give you a brief overview of where we've got to, and then we'll throw it open for discussion. So Leah.
So my name is Kasper.
Sorry, my name is Andrew Pullifat. I'm the Director of Global Partner Digital. I do apologise. I'm a bit jet lagged, so I'm not quite.
And I know most of you here in this room, and what we've been doing at GPT and a number of partners and people in this room was trying to engage in this process over the last couple of years since the review started heating up, and we're now looking to build and get civil society to get more engaged in this part of the process, which is coming to a head, and it's going to culminate this December in New York at General Assembly. So what I'd like to do just quickly is kind of give a bit of a background for people who are not super familiar with the process. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing the WSIS history, because I think people can read up on that, and it's not going to be useful. We only have 45 minutes. I think for the purpose of this session, we'll do a quick run through of the process and what we're expecting, and then I'd just like to ask to have a conversation about where people are, what we could be doing, and have a bit of a strategic discussion of what the possibilities for civil society engagement and promoting the public interest in this space could be. So just briefly going back to what the WSIS is and how it's been set up. Back in 2002, it was, I think, a resolution of the UN General Assembly that set up the process after it's recognized, this is from the resolution, recognizing the urgent need to harness the potential of knowledge and technology for promoting the goals of the UN Millennium Declaration, and to find effective and innovative ways to put this potential at the service of development for all. This is important because it highlights what the original WSIS process was meant to be about, and this focus on development and bringing the technology and finding ways to use technology to for the purpose of development, and exactly, that's ICT for the focus. Like where we were in 2002 is quite instructive, so we were quite in a different situation that we're talking about now. But beyond numbers, where we were in 2002, what's important is that it completely changed the political environment of what we're talking about and how different actors are looking at this space. Because of the implications to social, political, and economic elements of our society that the internet has brought, the governments are now playing a much more active role in the process. So, where we just quickly what happened in 2003 and 2005. The first phase, which was held in Geneva, was looking to, kind of based off of that recognition and the need to convene the summit, was to set up the achieve a people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented information society. The outcomes of that first phase were the declaration of principles, but also plan of action with particular targets and action lines. They came up with 11 action lines, which you can see here, stakeholders' role, ICT infrastructure, media, culture, diversity. And what they've also looked at was who the facilitators for each of these action lines were. So different UN agencies were designated to lead on these action lines. So that was 2003. What happened between 2003 and 2005 was that several issues in the first phase that remained unresolved, and in particular internet governance issues, as well as the financial mechanisms, were left unresolved, and they said, okay, let's talk about that in the next phase, which was in Tunis 2 years later. And at the beginning, I think they addressed, and the people who have been involved and who know more about this than I do, obviously wasn't involved in this phase of the WSIS. As far as I understand, the financial mechanisms element was addressed quite early on, and that was resolved. And what was left was the IG, so the internet governance issues. And that was the bit that almost broke the process in 2005. In the end,
Can I just say, was anyone at Tunis?
yeah, it would be.
No. How many of us were there?
Oh wow.
4 of us.
So you're there, so okay, so 4 people. And can I just ask one more follow-up question? How many of you have been following the process in the last couple of years, or have been engaged at all?
Not too close.
Okay. Right. So feel free to interrupt as well if this is if you feel any further elaboration of this is necessary. Just thinking about why this was important and what happened in Tunis and why this was important, kind of looking at it from not only from a development perspective, but from a governance perspective as well. This was the Tunis agenda and the outcomes of that second phase. What we got was, for the first time, we got a definition of internet governance. So when people talk about internet governance, they go back to the Tunis agenda, they go back to that definition. Whether or not it's helpful or not, whether it's still relevant is a question, right? But it does remain as a reference point for anyone who's working in the internet governance field. For all of us who have been involved in the Internet Governance Forum, it also set up the Internet Governance Forum, right? So it was in 2005 when the IGF was established as a way of addressing some of the issues that were raised at the summit. Perhaps the last thing to mention there was that the process of enhanced cooperation was set up kind of as in addition to the IGF. And that was, I don't know, Anya, I'm sorry, I see that you're reading. I don't want to go too much into the enhanced cooperation process because it's one of those things that they.
I think it was really a political football.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole battle was: should governments run the internet? Should they not run the internet? What's the government's role? There wasn't really an agreement, and so people fixed it. This is actually from the EU. Enhanced cooperation is the European Union phrase that describes areas beyond the treaties that states agree to cooperate within the EU. And someone thought it was a useful phrase to borrow and apply to the internet globally.
There's a guy, Raul Lecheria, who was on the Uruguay delegation during those discussions, and he was very active in that.
Did he actually invent the term?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but it did emerge out of that. He wrote a paper at the time, which you can find. He was the guy with the head like in Uruguay and has moved on to the society. But he did write a paper at the time and said quite a bit about what was going on.
Cooperation is what it actually means.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And maybe can I put you on the spot, Paul? Like, from your perspective, what were these solutions trying to address? What were the basic problems back then? So when you go back to the 2005 in the Tunis phase and the establishment of the IGF and enhanced cooperation, what were the issues that you think people
The IGF came out originally from the work group on government's rights. So that was the group that worked intersessionally between 2005, 3 and 2005, the next phase, and it defined, laid out that definition of internet governance and also by government, but governments through WSIS decided that the internet was important, and therefore as governments they said how is it governed, and then they went on a process of discovery and they discovered how it was governed. They discovered the multi-stakeholder process. They didn't invent it. These were actually discoveries about why the internet was as successful as it was, and the IGF came out of that. And I think the IGF, and I think as Andrew said, that really I wasn't in the discussions, but I think the enhanced cooperation thing was a political compromise.
I just want to apologize. You guys know that I think this conversation is extremely important, but it's the most important day for internet freedom in India, and the court is delivering a verdict on the unconstitutionality of certain provisions right
Okay.
now. I'm going to go with my Indian colleagues.
Good
Good luck.
Let us know what happens, yeah?
The first one has been declared unconstitutional.
Hey.
Yeah. Okay, it's a little wins.
Little wins.
Yeah, big wins.
Yeah, I mean, and I wasn't extreme this, but I heard it, and I think that one thing that stuck with me is that in 2003, I mean, this was, a very governmental setting, and my understanding is that actually a lot of non-governmental stakeholders knocked at the door, and they invited themselves into the discussions because the internet has to be well in a decentralized way. So there was a big evolution from 2003 to 2005 through the work of the wiki, finding what the terms mean, and also sort of creating the foundation of the WSIS as now, creating those understanding that.
I think that's important. When we go back to what's on the agenda, what will be discussed, the unresolved issues. I think for me, when I started engaging in this process, what was really interesting to see is that the same issues and the same questions that were asked back then, and what the issues were, are actually being perpetuated now. So the questions about roles and responsibilities and how to achieve more equitable distribution of or how to harness the potential of ICTs to be haven't been resolved. We have participating in the session, but just yeah, I think so. This was just kind of like what the Tunis agenda came about. So part of the IG was also they set up something called the Digital Solidarity Fund. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's from what I've heard, it hasn't been seen as particularly successful. Right? Basically, it's seen as a total disaster. Sorry.
It has been seen, yeah.
Yeah. And what's happened after 2005, the different organizations and facilitators of different action lines have started working on implementation. And this is even just like the ITU, UNESCO, and CSTD have been working on different elements of implementation. A big question for us, kind of looking at what's happened since then, was any of this successful? Like, has the implementation achieved anything to promote not only that? If we go back, what was the people-centered? Where are we? People-centered, inclusive and development-oriented information society. Like, do we have that? And looking honestly at what the WSIS has done, has it done anything to contribute to that? I don't know how people around the in the room feel about that. That's a question that I think we need to think about, and thinking about the review. And the review is actually going to look at both what's happened and assess the implementation that's happened so far, and look at what the next stage for WSIS should be. So that kind of dual element of like, okay, how do we feel about what's happened so far, and then what should happen next? I think in terms of what the WSIS is, if people want to add anything, I don't know if anyone wants to, if that interpretation was. Yeah, so let's just kind of talk a little bit about the overall review and what's happening now. In the last 2 years, the different agencies and facilitators that have been implementing WSIS outcomes have actually looked at and done their own review process. So the ITU has done their own review of the WSIS implementation, and that culminated last year in a high-level event that was preceded by a multi-stakeholder regulatory platform also called the MPP. It was facilitated by the ITU, but I think it was having participated in the process. It was actually fantastically inclusive, and it really was an exemplary process of how to engage different stakeholders in the process and in the review. Unfortunately, we're not likely going to see that level of openness in the upcoming overall review happening in New York, but perhaps thinking about kind of strategic engagement, we could point to that as a good example of what we could build upon. We can come back to that. So just quickly, the UN General Assembly was called upon. UN General Assembly called upon by the Jewish agenda to conduct an overview this year, coming to the 10-year point since the original WSIS. And they have last year decided how they're going to do this, and the modalities for the review that we're looking at is we're going to have a 2-day high-level meeting that's going to happen at the fringes of the General Assembly in New York in December, and it's going to be preceded by an intergovernmental preparatory process, which also takes into account inputs from all of the relevant WSIS stakeholders. What's unclear at the moment is that how that input is going to be collected, solicited, and we're not going to know that until at least June. And what we're expecting in terms of the timeline, the June deadline is it's a date set by the modalities resolution for when the two co-facilitators, two governmental co-facilitators are going to be set up to decide on how the review is going to be run from June until December, and how the intergovernmental preparatory process is going to be run. And it's all going to culminate in December at this WSIS event at the UN General Assembly. I think that's kind of sums it up a little bit. I don't know if anyone wants to add, if I missed anything out of what we know what's going to happen. Paul.
The outcome includes the future of the IGF, right?
That's right.
Square of things.
That's right. So I mean, in terms of what's going to be on the agenda, apart from, as I said, it has a dual element of what's happened so far and the assessment of implementation, and also kind of looking at what should we do next after this. It's very likely that it's going to address unresolved issues from the original summit. And as I already said, like how we achieve the people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented society. So there's definitely going to be a development aspect to it, and the question of how much this framework has contributed to achieving this goal. Perhaps I think an important thing to bear in mind is that what other framework do we have in the international system to actually support this goal, to contribute to this goal? And the answer is not very much. The current discussions about the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, at the moment have only 4 mentions of ICTs. So it's not a very robust approach to this issue. And if we think that an international framework is useful, then WSIS is probably our best bet. But it is a question of how to make it, how to actually make it useful, and being honest about what's worked and what hasn't worked.
You might have already touched on this, but is there going to be any room for NGO involvement?
That's the big question. That's a $1 million question. So as I said, like there is this kind of the UNGA is mandated to take into account inputs from all relevant WSIS stakeholders, but that might be just like some sort of what that would be extent. That's a question as well.
Because we have such set processes for like Human Rights Council or UNGA or whatever, but this is just
Yes.
There is one of a group of NGOs are starting to meet to talk about how to intervene in this process of engagement from that point. And obviously one of the great conversations to have would be to talk to the human rights movements based in New York and people used to lobbying EU NGO to So if there are people here who have any experience in New York, it would be great to plug you into that group, because when that happens, we need to be figuring out how to get public interest voice into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, all our lobbying is about the UN human rights resolution every year at the UNGA, but not anything specific to that.
Right.
We've really done stuff in this like ITU and satellite jamming, which is fine, but I think we definitely want to get involved in this and we're not yet. So
Right.
I'll speak to you after.
Yeah.
And no, that's a very good point. And actually, so Iceland, for example, is I have a colleague who's going to New York to meet with people from the missions. Obviously, this is a very different dynamic in New York than in Geneva. Delegations in Geneva are aware of the WSIS, the multi-stakeholder model, etc. New York seems to be much more political, issues, development, you mentioned SDGs, security, etc. So the dynamic is very different, and I think that's a challenge because the WSIS has happened, first of all, in a very decentralized way. The most centralized process has been, the WSIS forums, Geneva, NGFs, but it's not really happening in New York. So you have New York setting up the WSIS, implementation and progress happening outside of it. Now the discussion is getting back to New York. One thing you mentioned, the NPP process. I was one of the delegates from NGO responsibility in that process. It was very inclusive, extremely painful, and every time you have so many different views inside. Something to keep in mind as well is that the chair of the NPP was difficult, the process as well. And
The Russian chair?
yeah, I mean, in some respects, it seems they wanted to push for the WSIS action lines, the ITU's role in that to be reconvened. So I think the MPP process is maybe offer guidance in the process this year, keeping in mind at the same time that
If I may say something about the NPP, I think that
Do you want to say what it is first?
so I mentioned it's the multi-stakeholder preparatory platform that just convened in the run to the high-level event that the ITU that was a culmination of the ITU review of the WSIS until now, and it was convened like over the last year. Actually started in 2013 and in June last year. And they came up with a statement in their assessment of the WSIS implementation. And they mainly focus on. They were meant to focus on the ITU's role in the implementation process, but actually went beyond that, and they did look like further other facilitators as well. And for as good as it was, I did find that it was really kind of straight. How do you say that? We were kind of put all stakeholders in a straitjacket. So you entered the process, and they already said, well, actually, we're going to start by discussing the existing action lines. But there wasn't really an open discussion at any point that did this work? Are we happy with this framework? Is this useful at all? And we kind of were pushed into, let's start talking about the action lines. That was it. So there was no question of whether these action lines and this framework was still applicable in any way, or whether it's.
So the inputs for December, it's very difficult to get a consensus because there is the outcome from the ITU. UNESCO did a review process in 2013, which was also very inclusive. There was a multi-stakeholder statement there. It's supposed to be good for that. The CSTD, which is another UN body, has done a full annual review of the WSIS. They have a report. It's going to be discussed further in May, beginning of December.
That's right.
So it's a lot of different inputs. At the end, there's going to be a high-level statement, which is likely to be more, high-level and political. And I guess, one of the questions could be as well with the new summit. I think last year the Russians proposed hosts of the new WSIS summit. Actually, this year there was a pushback.
Was that the one in Sochi? That
Yeah.
was Sochi, yeah.
So instead, there is a two-day high-level event in December, but we can get back on.
And I think one of the discussions, just a final picture about civil society groups, we talked about this so far. So we've had some discussions with a group of people in Paris. And I think, our reflection is what we do too often in civil society is react to what other people do and respond to positions developed by governments and other groups. And by the time we get around to responding, those positions are fixed, they're hardened, it's political negotiation, we don't really impact on it because we're always reacting to things we've done. So one of the things we try to do is to say, regardless of what we think the governments might try and do and how the process works, what is it that we would want from a review of this whole World Summit? And I think we fixed on 3 issues. One was a reinforcement of a commitment to multi-stakeholder processes of decision-making, which for us is important because it recognises the legitimate role of civil society groups to participate in internet policy discussions and shape the environment. Secondly, to have a strong human rights focus and say whatever arrangements are adopted, they should respect the principle that human rights apply online as well as offline, and that human rights should be integral to both the governance and the engineering and the commercial and political shape of the internet. And thirdly, that there is a development agenda still, that the internet has now, the growth of the internet has actually slowed down. It was growing one time 12–15% a year. Access is now down to about 3% a year. And essentially, I think the existing infrastructure of telecommunications that sustain the growth of the internet to 40% of the world's population has more or less reached the easy wins that the private sector can achieve. And to take the internet to the next 40% is going to require something very different. Different kind of technology, different level of investment, different political requirements. If you want to lay fiber cables across the mainland of Africa, for example, that raises a whole bunch of questions of governance and political stability. So there's a very big development agenda, which we are framing as about access to infrastructure, affordability, and availability of relevant local content in local languages. So it's not just a kind of an elite mechanism. So those are the issues that the civil society groups that talked about this so far have decided they want to work on. We've set up 4 small working groups. One on how do we get into the process, like more of a tactical advisory group, if you like, to advise us on how we actually intervene. Secondly, one to define a human rights agenda for this process proactively. The third one to develop a multi-stakeholder, the concept of multi-stakeholder working, and the fourth to have a development agenda. So regardless of what the governments do, regardless of what the companies say, we have our set of thoughts, views, and inputs that we want to put into the process to try and shape it.
Sorry, Andrew, whose process was that? Those groups?
It was a very ad hoc group of organisations that met in Paris at the UNESCO site. So it was literally the kind of 30 or so groups who managed to make it. We just had a day's meeting before UNESCO. So this isn't to say this is that, well, there may be other issues, maybe the wrong issues, and we would encourage anybody to set up collaboration around an issue that you think is uncovered.
Well, you just brought that out a little bit before to answer your question. It was back in November, December, actually at the last IGF MAD meeting. I was talking to Nico's colleague Constance from ISOC, and we were sitting down and talking about the IGF renewal and how that's part of the IGF renewal is part of this process, right? So whether or not the IGF gets renewed will be decided. And we were sitting and saying, like, well, actually, we agree on this. Like, the technical community and the civil society groups have a lot in common in this. They can share a lot of common interests. So why don't we kind of come together and say, so we met on the margins of this UNESCO conference, and first we started talking between with ISOC and civil society groups and ICC basis, so International Chamber of Commerce also got involved. So we actually had a civil society part of the meeting where we discussed sort of our issues and our strategies and how to approach that. And we've also had a really good, I think, 2-hour session with the different communities where we had a technical community, the private sector, and the governments to discuss kind of where the common interests lies and where we can collaborate going forward. Because we did recognize that there might be issues where we diverge, and that's.
I'm sorry, but
yeah.
I don't want to take over with of IGF, is that a fourth group? Because
That's the
the
multi,
IGF.
it's the multi, I think the IGF renewal will be part of the multi-stakeholder working group. So that's definitely clear. All the civil society meetings I've seen in the last year agree they want the IGF to be renewed with a longer with a solid mandate. And that will be looked at in that multi-stakeholder group.
But just one thing on that, however, like having said that, a number of groups did stress that they didn't want unconditional IGF mandate renewal. So we don't want the IGF just for the sake of being there. It needs to be contributing to the process. It needs to be, we want the recommendations that came out of the working group, the CSP working group on IGF includes to be implemented. That needs to be done, that needs to happen. So the IGF is not there just to exist as a discussion forum, although that has value in itself.
Yeah.
But there are kind of conditionalities even on that and on multi-stakeholderism as well. So it's not just the idea of multi-stakeholderism. It needs to be, substantiated with, I think, thinking about
A bit more
human rights.
thinking.
Yeah, a bit more thinking about
Yeah.
that.
It's also got to do with outcomes as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
That one's done.
Yeah, there is something, I'm usually in the category of people who try to encourage being very cooperative and so on. Here, I would like to take a different tack. I fully support what you're saying. But there are two elements that I think need to be conveyed publicly or more discreetly regarding this. I find it unconscionable that 10 years after the WSIS, the format for the WSIS review is less multi-stakeholder than the WSIS itself. This is unacceptable. We need to find a way for a few governments to say that this is unacceptable. Because otherwise there is one side of the mouth that is talking about the multi-stakeholder process. And when it comes to the UN, in New York, the very same delegations, I'm not even mentioning the countries, it might be my own one, they say something completely different. When it comes to national discussions in the UN, it's going to be completely intergovernmental and they can perfectly comfortable. This is unacceptable. And as a matter of fact, talking about UNESCO, when you look at the stack of the documents that were distributed, I find it unacceptable that a meeting of UNESCO with all the countries that are part of UNESCO on the internet that has been requested by the governments themselves has been funded by private sector and so on, by the usual suspects. You get Germany, you get Finland, you get the Netherlands, you get Sweden, and you get Switzerland. These are the same only countries that have carried the whole burden of multi-stakeholderism for the last 10 years. This is not acceptable. So that's a general message regarding it is not acceptable that the process 10 years later is more closed than it was in the first. The second thing regarding the IGF, I personally believe that given all the replications of the national and regional IGFs, if for whatever reason there were no renewal of the mandate, the message should be, don't worry, it will happen nonetheless. So fundamentally, it will happen. And I'm volunteering here today with everybody that we know to say, if for whatever reason at the end of the year, it is not renewed, we need to all get together and find a way to organize it next year. Mexico has already theoretically volunteered. I would love a lobbying message that says, could Mexico please stand up and say, even if it's not renewed, we think it's useful to have it.
Good point. I know we've kind of thrown a lot of acronyms. It's the bane of anything to do with the United Nations. And letters. I forget what most of them are, and it's my business. So I have to confess. Any questions about anything that you've heard so far?
I have a question for Bertrand. But you said that that it's unacceptable how the process is run and how the review process is being, the modalities for the review process. But what do you think that civil society groups should do? Like if we say this is unacceptable, does that mean, or does it fall from that argument that we shouldn't engage, or?
No, not at all. Quite on the contrary, the foundation of the engagement is to do what we are all done in the WSIS itself, bang on the door and explain that it makes no sense. I mean, I say very provocatively here, I can say very calmly and say, are you comfortable with the fact that we are all promoting the multi-stakeholder model in the documents of Tunis, of all places, 10 years ago? And 10 years later, the review system, although the WSIS forum every year, even the ITU has managed the WSIS forum that is multi-stakeholder every year. The CSTD has opened a little bit as the IGL, and 10 years later, the review of this whole process is just 2 days of intergovernmental discussions. It sounds strange. So on the contrary, it's a strong engagement.
And I think something else very useful is if you work with the governments in the countries you come from, you're lobbying them, or saying anything to them to raise these kinds of issues about their own policy and the way they will behave in Geneva would be very useful. To remind them that there is a constituency out there that believes in human rights and development and in multi-stakeholder working. Because I think quite often the governments don't get that pressure from their domestic constituency. And I think it's very important in such a politicised environment as the UN for them to be aware that this is not what governments think, this is what we think. And this is what our view is of the process to go.
No, I think this is a very effective method as well. For example, during the ITU Weekend conference, which was again the treaty making conference, very close, something that I certainly was to encourage its chapters, which are also obviously society organizations in different parts of the world, to actually reach out to the governments. And actually, many people in those chapters are well connected to the Ministry of Communications and to the government. So, I think that civil society can make its voice heard publicly, statements, shouting. They can also engage directly with governments as well.
Just got a couple more minutes before we need to finish. Next step,
Yeah, so as Andrew mentioned, there are these fluid groups, and it's just Jeremy's there as well. So she's actually leading on one of the groups on the one on multi-stakeholder mechanisms, and Marianne Franklin is leading from the Arab Coalition. Is leading on the Internet Rights Principles Coalition. She's leading on the one on human rights, and to see kind of what we do around that objective. And Stuart Hamilton from the International Federation for Libraries Associations. Yes, he's leading on the development and access objective. But feel free to let us know if you're interested at all. We can plug you in and see how that's going. I think one of the things that we would like to do is put together a joint, either a statement or a starting point that pulls together these 3 elements that Andrew's mentioned, and then see how we can strategically use that to engage either the missions in New York or the President of the UN General Assembly, who's likely going to be an important player, and also on those terms engage with other stakeholders who are interested in the process to see where we can find areas of agreement.
But Laura and I will be here for 2 days, so we have to be the junction box. So in other words, if one of those issues you think, oh, well, I'm interested in the access issue, and actually contributing, or at least hearing more about that, we can connect you to the people who are working on the access issues. If your area is human rights, we can make that connection as well. So just let us know. We'll make sure we connect you to the people who are currently planning to sort of work on this. It'll be an online discussion between a group of people. So very easy to get involved, very open, no membership criteria or anything. Anyone willing to help is very welcome.
It'd be really interesting if anyone has suggestions on how to strategically approach, missions in New York who have experience with that, dealing with that side of things. That would be really useful as well.
Because I think in our world we've not really dealt with New York that much. So anyone with New York experience would be really welcome. Looking at you and anyone else.
And yeah, ideally, we should act before the August draft statement, or just to be more effective, or to ensure we could have some impact.
Maybe.
Absolutely. If anyone has been engaging or is engaging with their governments in this process, so I'm on a UK multi-stakeholder advisory group into the governance, and they've already set up a working group. They have the EU has a concept paper and a strategic paper already circulated with all the tactics topics with everything broken down, different actors that they're going to engage with, and
The businesses are organised.
The businesses, I mean, so like we're behind
We're
already,
behind.
so thank you for making that point. If we want to engage, we need to do that really quickly and be ready by June to actually, you know, to decide, at least have our terms for engagement ready.
What's the source of information online about this?
What's the best source?
Question.
On what, on the review?
Well, yeah, that would be so. Yes.
There's been a Deborah Brown from APC, and together with us, we've put together a brief on the WSIS, which we can circulate, which I think people have said has been quite useful. We can circulate that.
You can put it on the best
It's like a
website.
two-pager on
Yeah.
all of this information. Maybe that would be it.
That's an excellent document on Reddit. Yeah. And ISOC is going to do a sort of WSIS resource center as well. But
We have a reading list as well, so actually, Paul, there's it's on our website if you want to have a look. I can tweet it.
That's a bit up to date.
So yeah, so it's
Up to date living sort of news about what's going on.
yeah.
Maybe myself.
Okay, that's a good point. There isn't a single civil society portal, but maybe we do have access to a portal called Best Bits, which Jeremy's the administrator of. So that could be a platform that can be used to keep the information up to date. Okay, can I thank you very much? Thank you, and as I said, let us know if you're interested, and we can connect you. Thanks.
Thank you.